but we want to be respectful of your time and stay on target as much as we can. Thank you so much for taking time today to learn more about philanthropy. We think this is really important. And I want to go ahead and just let you know, we're going to share slides throughout the presentation. And then afterward, what we'll do is I'll close that out and we can actually have some Q&A where we can interact with each other, okay? And if you have any questions, please feel free to list those in the chat. We do have a couple of our Center for Nonprofit and Philanthropy staff members who are there, and they will make sure that we as speakers get to see your questions and comments, okay? Sound good? Get some gigum thumbs up for that? Wonderful. I'll go ahead and get started sharing. So today we are going to be talking about how philanthropy has evolved over the last 30 years. There's a couple reasons that we chose this time frame. One is it's really looking back at the sort of the beginning of when this all happened, but my colleagues at Grand Valley State University, they are celebrating their 30th anniversary as one of the very first nonprofit centers in the country. So when I saw that they had issued this report, it made a whole lot of sense. I thought for us to think about what that means for us in Texas, particularly given our center is only 5 years old. We have a lot to learn from them and how we build out our own structure. So we hope today is going to be really educational for all of us. If you are new and we're just intrigued by the topic, our Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy is housed in the Bush School. And for public service administration, we have masters, we have some online graduate certificates, an online master, and we also have started some continuing ed. We do board trainings, things like that, that are labeled capacity building. So the reason we are here is to try and help support our nonprofit sector in Texas. And hopefully beyond, but we have a big enough state. We've got quite a bit of work to do just within our borders. So here to help you in any way that we can. So always feel free to reach out to see if we have a program to support you and your staff. I would love to introduce both of our speakers today, Dr. Michael Moody. He holds the Fry Foundation Chair in Family Philanthropy. And Michael is actually, you can read the slides. I don't want to read through everything, but something that's fun about it is, correct me if I'm wrong, you were the very first employee at the Center for Philanthropy before it became a school?
Maybe fourth or fifth.
Okay, I was thinking you were the first student or first.
I was definitely the first student, yeah. First student to get hired, yes.
Okay. So he worked with Mr. Payton, and those of you that know my work and career over time, I believe in sort of the Payton philosophy for how we think about philanthropy. It's inclusive, and I know Michael is also someone who deeply believes in the fact that we look at this from a humanistic perspective. We also share the fact we both went to the University of Chicago, but his PhD is from Princeton, mine's from Indiana. So we broke at that point. We have a little overlap. But he spent a lot of his career thinking about what philanthropy means in society, and particularly in the last few years, thinking about generational impact and multi-generational giving. So can't wait to hear his wisdom. And now Jeff Williams is with us as well as the director of Community Data and Research Lab at the Johnson Center. I had the privilege of meeting Jeff at our Nova. And so excited because I'm fascinated by the work he's doing. Particularly took time for this project to look at Texas specific data out of a national research study that he's done. So I'm very grateful for that. But he's really passionate about connecting data to people. And you know that's something we care a lot about at the Bush School, is making sure that we care about practitioners and translating research into action and making sure that everything we're learning is making our communities better. So he studied at Michigan State, University of Minnesota, and University of Michigan. So you got both of the big schools in Michigan, right? So you have a split household within yourself, right? But Jeff, thank you so much for being with us. And with that, we will go ahead and dig into what we're talking about today. You see here, the image is actually the cover of the report that Michael and his team have issued at the Johnson Center. And we're really reflecting over how the field has changed in that period in some of the most significant ways. We're looking at changes, we're trying to look at data and to see why that's important and what sort of implications that there might be for us in the future. But as many of you know, when we start talking about organization assessment, strategic planning, things like that, we always talk about having a snapshot of where we are before we head into that kind of work. And that's essentially what this report and today can give us, is to say, now where have we come from, where are we, and how do we move forward? With that, I'd love to turn it over to Michael and let him start talking about some of the most significant points from the report.
Yeah, so thanks for having us, and I'll just say, we start the report with this. I guess I considered a cheeky comment, which is that 30 years is for some fields is not a very long time, like geology, not a very long time to talk about 30 years of change. But in philanthropy, it's actually a really long time. Not because philanthropy hasn't been around forever, which it has, but the last 30 years have really been a massive change really seen massive changes in the field, changes that are continuing now. A lot of big questions that we face as a field now. And if you're a researcher or a nonprofit professional or a student or a grant maker, you're wherever you sit in this philanthropic ecosystem, you know that there's some big questions happening, big changes happening. And so we thought in our 30th anniversary, it'd be useful to look back at where we were in 92 or around the mid 90s versus now, and use that as a way for us to kind of think about where we're going and help us prepare for those next 30 years. But this is really a time of tumultuous change. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things in the report. You can read the rest of the report for a lot of others, but the first and biggest one probably is going to be around the changes in the nature of giving. I'll also talk a little bit about the changes in the nature of nonprofits and their budgets, and then Jeff will talk about that more specifically in terms of Texas. But in terms of changes in giving, many of these I'm sure you're familiar with. We know that giving has continued based mostly on Giving USA estimates to be about 2% of GDP. And so it just kind of grows at the same rate that the economy, people in the field have been trying to raise it off that 2% for years, and we've never really been able to do it. But so the amount of giving has continued to go, and has continued to sort of grow along with the economy. But what's really changed is not the amount, but where that's coming from, sort of the mix of sources. And in a minute, we'll look at specifics about the mix of sources, the nature of who's giving that and who's maybe giving less now than they were 30 years ago, and the rise of some new forms of giving, as you can see here, obviously donor advised funds being one of those that's really significantly grown. So the way I like to put it is that the pie of philanthropy has kind of steadily grown. What's changed is where the sources of that pie are coming from, that amount that's given philanthropically every year. More and more of that pie is being given by fewer and fewer people and families. That's really the major story about the giving changes in the last 30 years, in addition to these new vehicles. And in fact, we know that when we look at household giving, you just ask a random sample of households, are they giving to 501c3 charities? That's actually gone down. And a few years ago, by the best estimate we have, this longitudinal research that IU's been conducting for many years, that went under 50% of households say that they make a contribution annually to a charity. That, to me, is the biggest. I always think of that as the biggest problem that we face for people who are concerned with philanthropy. But what that doesn't mean, though, we've got fewer and fewer households giving to charity, but charity giving continues to go up with the economy. That means that these families and individual donors at the top of the economic pyramid are giving more and more every year. And that's really the dynamic that we see happening. So in terms, just a few facts about these mega donors. The way we put it in the report is mega donors have become so much more mega. I think you see this if you follow Mackenzie Scott, giving, we don't really know exactly how much. I think the last estimate was since 2019, she's given 12 or $13 billion. But each year she's giving, over $5 billion and maybe as much as $10 billion That's there's nobody in history who's in adjusted dollars who's given that much. Bill Gates now is not giving that much to the Gates Foundation, which the Gates Foundation is the biggest foundation in the history of foundations, even if you adjust for the dollars. So we talk about, for example, back in 1992, the biggest grant maker was in terms of annual grant making and also in endowment was the Ford Foundation. And in today's dollars, they gave about $1 billion a year. And right now, the Gates Foundation is giving $6 billion a year as the largest foundation grant maker, and is looking to ramp that up as they spend down. So that's grown considerably more than GDP. If the Ford Foundation is nowhere near what the Gates Foundation is in comparable dollars. And so we know that those foundations, what that means is that foundations have tremendous more power. Individual donors like Mackenzie Scott and others have significant more power and influence in the field. And we see this in the critiques of philanthropy and other things. One last little tidbit, and then we'll look at some of the numbers, is I saw this thing in the New York Times probably 6-8 months ago that said if you calculated in today's dollars, when they first started to do the Forbes 400 list, which was 1982, the number one person on the Forbes 400 list in 1982 in the same dollars would be 182 on that list of Forbes 400 today. That's how much more concentrated wealth has become, and subsequently donors from that. So if we turn to the next slide, you can see some of these changes in the ratio of what comes from different sources. And this is Giving USA for those who are familiar with it. Looking at 92 and 2021, individuals have always been, this is one of those myths that people forget, that individuals are in fact by far the biggest source of charitable dollars. Because people think of the Gates Foundation and others as doing all this, most of the giving, but individuals, Sunday collection plates, giving to, your annual payroll deduction for United Way, as well as those Mackenzie Scotts and others who give at massive levels. Has always been the biggest source. But if you look at 92, it was 82% of the total. And in 21, it's only 67%. And then you look at foundations, they were a bit over, they were 6.5% in 92, and they've grown to almost 19%. And that's really the significant shift in the 30 years. Everything else has sort of stayed roughly the same. And it's not as though individuals are giving less, although we know some households are, but we have bigger and bigger individual giving like Mackenzie Scott. That it's not as though this is caused by individuals giving less. This is really caused by foundations growing, like I just described with Gates versus Ford. And they're just more, they're for every nonprofit fundraiser, these major donors and foundation giving is a bigger part of the mix than it was 30 years ago. And that changes the field. That means that changes your job as a fundraiser, changes the field of grant making and giving. So that's, this has a lot to do with increases in the stock market, and there are some moves toward more limited life foundations, for example. So foundations are like Gates are giving more each year, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons behind this, but this is a big fact about the change in giving. Then my second point I want to make, and I'll turn it over, is about giving, is about the growth of nonprofits. And nonprofits, much is made about how many new nonprofits there are, and it's true. Nonprofits continued over the last 25, 30 years to grow at a steady pace. So in fact, if you look at the numbers here, there were about nearly 2.5 times as many nonprofits in 2020 as there were 25 years prior. And that grew, so that's significant growth in a sector. They're comparing to, say, other industry sectors, nonprofits have had a very healthy growth rate. And there are way more nonprofits now than there were, which means a whole lot of choice for donors and a lot of opportunity for collaboration, but also the threat of overlap and competition among nonprofits. And so a lot of dynamics in the field are generated from this growth. But the real change in the 30 years is not just the sheer numbers, it's the finances of nonprofits. And so if you look, they've got the numbers on here for income and assets of all public charities, and then just those at the very top. So just as a comparison to these percentages, in these same 25 years, GDP in the US grew 180%. And so if you look at this, that means that the nonprofit income, which grew at 354%, right? Double the rate of GDP. And their assets grew even more than that, a 478%. So what, and then if you look at the top 100, this is not the top 10% of charities. This is the top 100 individual charities. They now own, by these numbers, they've gone up even more. They own 30% or 22% of all the assets in the field, and 30% each year of all the income goes to just those top 100. So this concentration of wealth in the largest part of the economy, the largest corporations, the most wealthy individuals, has been mirrored exactly by what's happening in the nonprofit sector. Those large hospital systems, those Harvards with trillions of dollars in endowment, those organizations at the very top are garnering even more of these resources and holding more of the assets. And then there's this incredibly long tail of a lot of very small and medium-sized nonprofits. And so the concentration of the economy is witnessed in the nonprofits as well. And nonprofits as a force in our economy, in terms of the amount of finances and assets they can bring to bear, is significantly bigger than it was 25, 30 years ago. Nonprofits just have more money and control more assets, and we see the consequences of that. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Angela for the next couple of slides.
Thank you so much. That's a lot for us to think about, and how we give and how we run our development shops, and also from the philanthropist perspective, how we're taking care of all the cities and all of our citizens in Texas. Compared to just the 4 metro areas. That concentration has a real impact for us. I wanted to talk with you all about a couple of things. One is religious giving. We know that religious giving and religious organizations are a large part of the social fabric, particularly here in the South where we live. But remember, across the board, at least according to Giving USA, in the 65 years we've been looking at it, religion has always been the largest recipient of philanthropic giving. So I wanted to look at that for a couple of reasons, because we're seeing a decline. You'll see on the right-hand side here that in the last 30 years, we've seen almost a 20% decline in giving to religion, although it still maintains its place as the top subsector as a recipient in the nonprofit space. We have a lot of nonprofits that have either faith connection or they are an umbrella under the diocese. So we see that in many areas. The Episcopalian churches and Catholic churches, and particularly, are focused on the east part of our state right now. That's an example. But what we've seen is those organizations, particularly our congregations of all faiths, are trying to figure out, what do we do now? Because we have seen also a decrease in church attendance post-COVID. So why is that a concern for me in particular? Because we could probably adjust some strategies around that, and to try and make sure that we're talking to folks that we may not see every Sunday or Saturday, whenever your faith is meeting. But my biggest concern around this is the fact that historically we have learned to give through faith organizations in our country, and that has significance as far as when we meet and ask people to do philanthropic autobiographies, for example, and say, when do you first remember giving? And overwhelmingly, a lot of people in that room, regardless of what room it is going to say they remember giving through their church, putting something in the collection plate. This stuck out to me as we were planning this presentation, because one of my students mentioned that her daughter asked the other day, why don't we give to the church, Mom? I thought we always did. And she's like, what do you mean? We've been giving. But during COVID, they switched to giving online. And so her daughter wasn't seeing that actual physical action of giving and that community that we're participating in the community with everyone. So that's just something that I think about as far as a way of, how do we invite people into philanthropy? How do we let people early in their life learn about giving to one another and actually see and model it? So that some of the implications around that we could talk later, but part of it is, are we doing this in our schools? Are we providing opportunities to learn about philanthropy in our youth organizations? So that's really the primary area. And those of you that are truly interested in faith and giving, I would refer you to the Lake Family Institute at Indiana's school, now, of philanthropy, because they've been studying this for quite some time. I'm by no means an expert in religious giving, but what does concern me is, how are we going to get people to know that it's great to volunteer and to give? And that leads to the second piece that I'm more concerned about, is our volunteerism. We've seen that decline over the last 2 decades in the United States. And we've done a study at the center. We're about to redo this. I think our numbers are from 3 years ago, but we've just been commissioned to do another Built for Texas report, and understanding our nonprofit our sector in the state. And what we found from the first one is that Texas actually lags the United States in volunteerism. And as I'm out doing capacity building work, I've worked with almost 90 organizations this year. There's not one that said they're not having trouble finding volunteers. We've also had another report that was issued by some of our colleagues at the Duguid Institute, the University of Maryland, that just came out, and they're reporting that their data says nonprofit CEOs, nearly 50% of them are saying that recruiting volunteers is a significant problem. So these two slides kind of tie together in the sense of how I'm trying to think about, what do we do to invite people into this incredible world of philanthropy? How do we encourage them to give? And you can see on the slides here, the slide to the right, you'll see that Texas is lagging the US just a little bit, okay, in both individuals formally and informally volunteering, okay? AmeriCorps does the study every 2 years, but it's showing that we are definitely a few percentage points behind. And because our colleagues today are joining us from Michigan, and also because I know Michigan has for 30 years had a center, but also a program called Learning to Give, where they focus on youth philanthropy. Their foundations have supported generously the research and development of philanthropy education. I was curious to see where that state is. And so they are actually ahead of the national average in formal volunteering, and significantly, like 5 percentage points ahead in individuals informally volunteering. So there have to be a lot more research to draw direct more than a correlation on that, but it's something for us to think about, and how we are working with people who are new to our organization, how we're working with young professionals, how we're working with local high schools to try and help them understand our organizations and invite them into this space so they can volunteer and give and feel good about helping their communities. Okay. So with that, I'd love for us to think more specifically about Texas, and I'll turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to show some of the numbers and data that he's been looking at for our state.
Thank you, Angela. Good day, everyone. I'm kind of a glutton for data, and that is, if I'm only looking at 1 or 2 990s, I get really bored. So I tend to look at 10 or 20,000 990s at once and do some large data sets. So what I'm about to show you is a data set that we've accumulated at the Johnson Center. It goes back just about 30 years. And we're pulling data from a number of different sources, directly from the IRS, from the NCCS, the National Center for Charitable Statistics Archives. But what few researchers do is kind of stitch that together over decades. They tend to look at 2 or 3 or 5 year periods. I like to look at 20 or 30 year periods. So as Michael was writing the narrative that Angela mentioned earlier in the presentation, I was kind of in my cube pulling the data that kind of underlied that narrative. And so I went back to that set and pulled out some things about Texas. So this is kind of your quick tour through some quick cross tabs, and it's going to try to be as plain English as possible for the data, to show you what I see as a researcher with given 30 minutes or less. What do you know about Texas? Well, what I know is that as of the December 21 Business Master File, kind of the big phone book of all nonprofits in the United States, Texas contains about 7%. So the 130,000 nonprofits that roam in Texas out of the 1.7 million in the United States, about 7%. a lot of people in the nonprofit world think that all nonprofits are, fully charitable, and it's not quite true. There are charities and there are non-charitable nonprofits. In plain English, I call that 501c3 and 501c everything else. So the C4s, C5s, C6s, C17s, let's just sort the world into C3 and C everything else. When we do that, we see that Texas has just a slightly over the expected share of 501c3 nonprofits, but only 6.2%. So that's hence the red and the green text there. So quite a bit behind the national average or the average of Texas nonprofits overall when we're talking about that non-charitable nonprofits. Those are things like Elks Clubs, chambers of commerce, clearly nonprofit organizations. They're just not charitable in their donation status. So let's look a little bit deeper on the next slide. I took a look at on a kind of a per capita basis, but it's per 10,000 residents. So for every 10,000 residents, Texas has about 45 nonprofits as of December of 2021. The national average is 54 nonprofits for 10,000 residents. So as Angela mentioned, seeing Texas kind of lagging national averages and some of the volunteering statistics, I'm also seeing that lag when we just look at the number of nonprofit organizations. So left-hand side says that Texas has the conclusion, Texas has fewer nonprofits than we generally expect if you had the national average. Right-hand side says, all right, let's step away from looking at all of the 130,000 nonprofits in Texas. Let's look at the 1 in 6 of the nonprofits that files that 990. Those 990 filers are where the vast majority of nonprofit employments, assets, revenue, activity, that's where the bulk of the activity is. It's about 80% of any of those numbers, even though it's only about 16% of the sector. On the right-hand side of this slide, when I look only at the 990 filers in Texas, I again see that they are smaller by both revenue and staff size than their national peers. I believe pictures say 1,000 words. So on the next slide, I'll show you those pictures. Left-hand slide is annual revenue of nonprofits. Right-hand slide is staff size for 990 filers. Red bars are Texas. Blue bars is every other state except Texas. So it's not the national average. It's the national minus the state of Texas. So it truly is everyone else. Notice as you go to the right-hand side of each of those charts, as we approach the 75th or the 90th percentile, you start to see that gap between the nation and Texas nonprofits really widen out. Whereas at the 90th percentile in the nation, that largest 10% of all nonprofits nationally has the median, the revenue median of that 90th percentile is about $7.6 million a year. Texas, it's almost $2 million less. Same thing on the staff size. Organizations at the 90th percentile nationally have an average of 90 staff members, employees on their 990. In Texas, that number is 53. So doing a little math and alchemy, we can start to say, what would the world look like if? So if Texas has 45 nonprofits for 10,000 and the national average is 54, if Texas had the same number of nonprofits per 10,000 residents as the nation, Texas would have about 28,000 more nonprofits that would account for about $30 billion more in revenue with about 90,000 more employees. So as Angela said in the introduction, I really like connecting data to people and people to action. And this is kind of that step, is just to say that you lag the national average really doesn't help you kind of comprehend where you fall. But numbers like 27,000 more nonprofits in the state or 90,000 more nonprofit employees starts to make the numbers more real. So just a couple more pictures of what I saw. All is not woeful in Texas. Texas nonprofits, the number is actually growing faster than the national average. So over that 30-year period of time that Michael was talking about in his narrative, nonprofits in Texas as a percent of US nonprofits went from about 6% to the 7.6% today. So the nonprofit sector is growing in Texas faster than the nonprofit average, even though you're still behind the national average. So this is if you're an optimist, this is the glass half full part of the presentation, that the sector in Texas is clearly catching on and moving, increasing its share. That share, I want to mention two other points, as Michael noted on the next slide, but that nonprofit growth in Texas is not even. We're seeing the number of public charities in nonprofits across the last 20 years increase. It's almost doubled, actually more than doubled. while the number of private foundations in Texas has remained essentially flat. So those bars left to right for each of those three groups show like about 7-year periods over the last 20 years. You can see the number of public charities line has gone about twice as high. The private foundation line is generally flat across that same period of time. However, here again is your optimist presentation part 2. Even though the number of private foundations in Texas has remained relatively constant, the final slide I wanted to show shows that the assets of those private foundations are dramatically increasing. 4 different bars here, or sets of bars, the median, the 75th and the 90th percentile of private foundations in Texas only. You can see at the largest, the 90th percentile, the assets have almost tripled in that 20-year period of time from an average of 3 million to an average of 9 million in the 90th percentile, and overall about a doubling from an average of 3 million to an average of 7. Last point I'll leave all of you with before I turn it back to Angela and Michael is this is a great slide to talk about how we all in the United States grossly misunderstand the nonprofit sector. And I will use this private foundation slide in that left-hand set of bars as an example. If I stop a person on the street and say, describe to me a private foundation, they're going to say it's a nonprofit entity with millions or tens of millions of dollars. And what that left-hand set of bars here says that the median foundation in Texas has assets of $458,000. That means half of all private foundations are smaller than $500,000 and half of all private foundations are bigger than $500,000. Same thing when you talk the nonprofit sector. Half of all nonprofits have total revenues of under $50,000 a year. So even though things are concentrating, as Michael has noted, there is still a huge portion of the sector that is very grassroots and comparatively small. So we have kind of this, when we talk about the nonprofit sector, which sector are we talking about? Are we talking about that concentration of 990 filers or high net worth donors or the largest foundations? That's one story in the sector. Or are we talking about where most of the organizations and kind of individual activity occurs, and that's in the smallest or the grassroots organizations? I will pause there. That's your quick tour through the numbers. I know it's kind of midday on a Monday. We're all starting our week, but I wanted to show you just what we see when I look at the data across 3 decades, specifically focused in Texas. Angela?
Thank you so much, Jeff. This, I think, some of it was startling to me, having worked in the nonprofit sector here for nearly 20 years, specifically in Texas. It's great when we can have an understanding of where we stand. And it is encouraging, I believe, to see that our sector is growing. We try and tell our students and we encourage them that this is a growing field across the country. This is a great sector in which to work. So it's nice to see some of the data supporting that. I'd love to pose to the two of you sort of what else do we know from a 30-year perspective? And within that, sort of what implications does all of what we just covered really have for us leading in the sector for the next, decade or so here in Texas, you think?
Yeah, so I'll go first. I'll just say a couple of the things that we know. Then again, you can encourage you to go and read the report and see how that relates to your experience. But some of the things I don't think these are going to be surprising, but there's certainly things that we hear about a lot as part of these big changes that I started this whole talk with. One is the rise in the attention to diversity, equity, inclusion in the sector. That's significantly more now than it was 30 years ago. And we see that showing up in many different ways in our work in the sector. Another one that we talk about is the increase in the focus on measurement and evaluation, metrics, outcomes assessments, those kind of things. It's sort of measuring actual impact, not just measuring did you do what you said you were going to do with the money in terms of your inputs and your activities. So and that again has tremendous implications for how people do their jobs, how we train people in this field, all of that. That's a big change in the last 30 years. I think I'll also mention this sort of blurring of the boundaries between what's nonprofit, what's philanthropic, what's business. We see there's this is in some ways for me the biggest change that I've seen, really having been around this field for all these years, all of these 30 years. There's just such a much more interest and willingness to do things. When you try to do good in the world, it's not automatically default that you're going to do that through a 501c3 nonprofit or by creating a private foundation. You may create a charitable LLC. You may have a big private foundation and convert it to a charitable LLC, like John and Laura Arnold and Arnold Ventures there in Texas. And a lot of other things happening, the rise of B corporations and impact investing and all sorts of other things and the changes in business schools. I mean, all sorts of things are showing us that philanthropy and business are looking a lot more like each other, and it's hard sometimes to tell which is which. And that's a big feature of what's going to be happening with us going forward. So those are some other things that were happening in the last 30 years. I'll just say a couple of implications that come to mind for me. One is this, I think, story that you got from Jeff's presentation as well as mine, which is a story of concentration of resources, especially at the highest levels, institutionally and individually. And that in and of itself doesn't necessarily, that in and of itself causes us a lot, especially critics, a lot of concern, right? Because it's about with concentrated purse strings comes concentrated power and the ability to make, if whatever Mackenzie Scott wakes up in the morning and decides that she's interested in funding, that's going to get tremendous more resources than something else. And that's true with any concentration in foundations or others. And so as you see that happening even more in Mexico, in Texas right now, then I'm working on a project in Mexico. So that's why I said Mexico. It's same thing's happening there too, your neighbors. As we see that happening in the future, that's going to be a real big challenge for all of us. I think the other part of that, the sort of flip of the coin, is when those people who are not at the elites are disengaging from traditional philanthropy, disengaging from volunteering. Their household is not giving anymore. The numbers would say that 1 out of every 5 households that gave, 30 years ago don't give 30 years later. And that, I think, is a problem, because philanthropy more and more becomes defined as only an activity of those sitting at the top of that concentrated pile of resources. And I think that's a real concern for us going forward. And there's a National Generosity Commission that's trying to look for how we address some of that. But I think that's certainly a big implication of this. The final implication is one that we talk about with Texas A&M, and we talk about here at the Johnson Center, and that is the need for more and more training and degree programs and research and other things, because this is becoming a much bigger field of work. Becoming a much more, many more people are taking jobs. You saw that tremendous growth in Texas, and the numbers, that's starting to ramp up, especially now. And so that's thousands of people who are going to need training in how to be a nonprofit manager, how to be a fundraiser. So I think the need for the work that we do in universities to train people is even bigger implication as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We can say ditto, particularly that last piece, as we're trying to build our center to really meet the needs of all the folks who are coming to us and starting nonprofits and managing the existing ones. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to add as far as implications you've been thinking about?
I'd just echo Michael's comment about the concentration and the blurring of the lines. We're talking as if the nonprofit sector is a monolith, right? And that includes the Mayo Clinic and then a community health clinic. And I think there is really the difference is, some concentration is to be expected, and kind of that's the way the modern world is working as it goes to scale. But there's this echelon, whether we're talking about private foundations, whether we're talking about nonprofits, whether even talking about non-charitable nonprofits, that are just massive, massive enterprises. And we kind of lump them in with, a soccer club PTA with 3 volunteers and $7,000 in the bank. So just echoing what Michael said, is that need for additional training, research, professional development training, and just attention to a sector that is so varied across the nation and employs, 1 in 10 people in the American workforce is employed by a nonprofit. And we just don't have the same level of information. I can get, Google and I in 5 minutes can come up with the list of all car dealers in Michigan. Google and I in 10 minutes cannot come up with a list of all nonprofits in Michigan. Like if you just think of the ways you engage in commerce, there's so much we don't know about the sector. And there's so much I can go know about in kind of auto dealers or kind of any other commercial enterprise. And that's also a big gap that our sector faces, is just that we have so little information compared to other sectors of the economy.
I think that's a very good point. Hopefully we might get a little more support from that with some of the legislation nationally and collecting some more data. That's those of us that care about nonprofit research and really like sector building work. We're encouraged that we may start collecting a little bit more data and differently than we have, so we can understand our sector better. But I think that everything that you've shared is absolutely something that we should be thinking about here in Texas. Another thing that I think we have to think about as well, as far as the implications, if people aren't learning to give, our demographics are changing so quickly. You know, it was nearly 10 years ago, we were named the most diverse state. And we're like Houston specifically was the most diverse city. And some of you are familiar with Steve Kleinberg's work and from Rice University around diversity and how that's changing how our cities are shaped. According to Dr. Kleinberg's work, by this year 2050, the rest of the country will start to mirror the population demographics we have here in Texas. So I think that's something that's very important. It's part of why I dedicated some of my, part of my dissertation focus around that, is because we have a real opportunity to try and figure out how we invite everyone in and really embrace this idea of inclusion in the world of philanthropy that has for so many decades been kind of reserved. If you say, what do you think of philanthropy? And we'll see if Michael and Jeff has also had this experience. But if you say, when I say the word philanthropy, what comes to mind? People in the room start yelling out like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Carnegie, Rockefeller. Right now with this bifurcation and what we're seeing as far as a concentration of assets, and also a decline in volunteerism, it is very concerning. We want to make sure that everyone understands their role and gets to participate in building our communities. And it's a concern too when we look at our state. One thing is that nearly 80% of Texans live in rural areas, but primarily our philanthropy is channeled into 4 metro areas. So what do we do about the mid-sized cities? What do we do about the smaller cities, and how do we help support them? And the way I've been thinking about it with some folks that I've worked with with capacity building at foundations is that perhaps we need a tiered structure, because it doesn't look the same. It's not a one size fits all. You don't need to necessarily have a PhD in philanthropic studies to run a volunteer program when for a community garden. We need to make sure that we are finding right size solutions. So those are some of the implications that I've been thinking about based on the work. And with that, I just have to applaud our presenters, because we're right on time to start asking questions. I have 12:44. Look at that. We would love to take any questions that we have from those who have joined us today, and whether it's about your organization or the larger philanthropy scope in general. And I'll go ahead and turn off our slides at this point. And I just want to point out, as you're thinking about your questions, though, that we did want to provide you with some resources. This presentation will be recorded and it will be uploaded on our center site. So you can go in and actually click through. I have the links here, or you can just use Super Google and get to these reports and all this data yourself. Okay, but all of these have been referenced. These sources have been referenced in our presentation today. Okay. And here's our contact information from the center. And with that, we'll start taking some of your questions. And if you're not comfortable asking in front of the group, you're certainly welcome to share those in chat, and they'll get to us. Okay. Here's one. I've got a couple coming in now. Terrific. So Seth's asking, I'd be curious, over the time period for Texas, how much government spending has changed, whether that's increased or decreased, How much of what the government has spent historically has been picked up by the nonprofit sector? Meaning, is the growth in 501c3s in Texas correlated to taking up the slack from government spending and services? And how much does this correlate to what we see nationwide? It's a great question.
Yeah, I don't have an answer because I didn't look at government spending in Texas. So I'll give a positive answer and a negative answer to that question. The positive answer is that the hypothesis that maybe the growth in Texas is really being fueled by government transferring programs from government into the social safety net or into the social service sector. I'll call that the positive answer. The negative answer is if that is going on and I'm transferring it into a sector that's underdeveloped relative to national peers, that would concern me in terms of kind of a social safety net perspective of one of the largest states in the nation. You would think that if you do that transfer, you'd want to at least be at the national average or higher in terms of just the ability to process that volume of money through. So I don't know the story in Texas specifically. And again, especially as we all have a more nuanced picture, I'd be really curious to look inside the Giving USA or some of the other reports at is the tradition of volunteering in Texas basically outside, I'll call the regulated 501c3 environment, meaning it's there, it's just not being picked up in the government reports. So that's, I think we're all getting a better understanding of that large portion of the sector that kind of sits outside of where a lot of our listed reports are. So a decently answerable non-answer.
Can I just add that I don't know, obviously also I didn't do this research on Texas government spending itself, but I know the work of people like Les Solomon and Steve Smith and others, scholars who've been studying this interaction between government spending, the government, but Alan Abramson, other people like that, and looking at this relationship between the government spending, especially at the federal government, and the growth in partnerships with nonprofit organizations. They generally find that this part of the story that we tell about nonprofits' budgets ballooning over the last several decades is an increase in government funding. So it's less about in their story, less about the government pulling back funding from certain areas and the shrinkage of government funding for things like social services, and then nonprofits using private money to rush into that gap, and more that governments are starting to deliver those services by contracting out to nonprofits, by making those government transfers to them. And so the rise of the federal budget for the percentage of the federal budget that goes through nonprofits, which then of course results in these increases in nonprofit income, that's more the story I know over the last several decades, and I would assume it'd be part of the story here. That doesn't mean that there aren't areas in which the government's dramatically pulled back and nonprofits have increased their role. But that growth, the government funding for nonprofits as a total amount of nonprofit revenue continues to be way bigger than private philanthropic contributions to nonprofits on the whole. Some, like religious nonprofits, they still get more money from charity, but healthcare, education, et cetera, they get more money from fees and services for what they do, and from government contracts and government funds. And so I think government funding and nonprofit funding tend to go up in tandem rather than as a replacement one for the other in general.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I think that, our team will write this down because as we're doing, getting to enter into a contract to study the nonprofit sector in Texas, maybe we can make sure that we do address this and think about government funding. We're developing a strong partnership with One Star in Texas as well, across a couple different areas, and hopefully we can together try and find some information about the government and how it's been funding. I don't have that information myself, but our research team can certainly look into that as over time, and I'm sure we'll be doing more of that work. We have another question from one of our students. Durand is asking, what are some tangible ways in which DEI can impact the space of philanthropy?
I'll give a big surprise, a data-focused answer to that question. And one is, as we've done some studies in Michigan of, was a nonprofit founded by or led by a member, currently led by a member of the BIPOC community. What we find is that the smaller the nonprofit, the higher likelihood that that statement is true. So that means and also the younger the nonprofit, meaning if a nonprofit was 10 years old or less, it's more likely to be headed by a member of the BIPOC community. So I think inside the space of philanthropy, it'll be just a little bit of time in the sense of as those 10-year-old nonprofits become 20-year-old nonprofits, that's part of the answer. But I think that also from the funding perspective means something. We have a lot of funders that come to us at the Johnson Center asking, can you help us identify kind of not the usual suspects? How do we go deeper into the communities? And one of my first answers is go look at your grant requirements. You see that line where you say, you must have a budget of $500,000 or more to apply for a grant. I say, well, right there, you're already at the 60th percentile of all nonprofits in the nation, meaning you've excluded the majority of nonprofits from even applying. So a lot of the conversations, especially when you talk in the DEI space, are, think younger and think smaller in terms of organizations, and you're more likely, at least in a state with Michigan's demographics. I'd be really curious to see how well that statement holds up in Texas, a much more diverse state than Michigan. I think there'll be elements that are true. But Angela, I take your comment earlier that, demographically, Texas runs 20 to 50 years ahead of the rest of the nation. I wouldn't be surprised if kind of for Texas, the answer would be look mid-size and below, whereas in Michigan, it's look kind of small and below. You're showing us the forecast of what's coming for the rest of the nation.
It would be great to get the actual data on that. I'm seeing some of that, like you said, as well, sort of like we're at the 15-year, perhaps, more of the mid-size organizations. When I did my dissertation, the one thing I can tell you is that the organizations, and this is specifically just dealing with board diversity, but the organizations that were under $500,000 in total revenue, they were significantly more diverse as well. So hopefully this is something we're going to continue to see. And we actually, if you guys don't know, we actually have one of our center professors, Dr. Kenny Taylor, who focuses on social justice and specifically leadership in diversity. And so that's something that we've actually a certificate and non-credit certificate in social justice and some other classes specifically about managing diverse workforces here at the Bush School. So we definitely care about this issue at our center. Part of it is we're trying to, we need to be able to have time to figure out some research studies to see how things are truly playing out, if that makes sense.
Can I just, I'll be very quick and so we can move on to the other questions, but I'll just say that, following up from our discussion that the increasing power of major donors and large foundations, we know we're tracking much better now. Organizations like NCRP, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, tracks, for example, the percentage of grant-making dollars that go toward organizations led by people of color or that go to causes that are directly related to things like racial justice. And it's a woefully small percentage, and we're paying a lot more attention to just how low that percentage is and coming up with strategies for how to do that. I think the other dynamic that's going on at that concentrated level is that we're starting to learn more and more about newer major donors of color who are starting what their giving patterns are going to be. And there's starting to be some research, or there's really been very little research on that in the past. But as we recognize that, as demographics of the U.S. start to look more like demographics of Texas, the demographics of those at the very top are going to be changing as well. They already are. There's some very, significant major donors, billionaire donors, for example, who are themselves people of color and who give to communities of color. But we still need a whole lot more detail on that. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to a report that came out last year from the Donors of Color Network on some really first kind of data on major donors of color for those who are interested. So,
thank you so much. And Michael, know that you've been committed to this as well. We'll let you and everyone on the call understand that last week our students in my fundraising course, they all presented on a different type of donor. So they were able to choose the donor, but they were able to study different constituencies. And it was really fun for them to be able to dig in and say, what is the Latinx community doing versus a Muslim community versus the Black community versus women versus high net worth donors. So it was fun that was a new assignment that we built in and wanted to make sure that we are starting to train people who are going out into the field to think about giving differently because our donors are going to be different over time, and it was a fascinating set of presentations. So our next question, Manuel's asking, is there pushback to inclusion of this topic in prevailing academic programs of study? And if so, why? Can we clarify that just a little bit? Were you talking about philanthropy as the topic or the nonprofit sector?
Yes, exactly. It seems to me like many academic programs are fixed in their curricula and may not be interested in including topics related to philanthropy or managing nonprofits or work of that nature. And maybe it's just an anecdotal feeling. It may not be true. It's just something I sense.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's the case. Maybe it's not the case, but if it is, why is that?
Yeah, I think I'll say something about this, given that we do talk about this as part of that report, and it's something that is near and dear to my heart. So, back in the early 90s was when we were first beginning to have conversations, and many foundations were putting money toward the development of philanthropic studies or nonprofit management as a field of academic study and as something you could get a degree in, whether that's graduate or undergraduate. And there has been tremendous growth in the number of those degrees, the amount of research that's done under the banner on philanthropy and nonprofits, but it still doesn't quite reach the level that we thought 30 years ago we wanted it to be. So there was this ambition that, we would learn as much about nonprofits as we learn about businesses in high school. And it would be the schools of nonprofit management would be as big as business schools or at least comparable in their size to nonprofits' size of the economy, that kind of thing. And they're just not there yet. There's been a lot of development. There's been tremendous growth of those kind of programs, but they just haven't grown as much as they can. So I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think and I think that now that things are becoming really blurry and people are, going to business school. I know a lot of people that are students that I encounter who say, I want to do good in the world. I'm going to go to business school and then work in the social sector, create a social enterprise or go out and run a B corporation or, where they're not looking to a nonprofit management degree or something to get it. So that's a challenge for us as well, is that, students the programs may even be available and students decide to go do something else because they think they can do just as much good being a socially conscious investor on Wall Street as they can by running a nonprofit. So there's a lot of headwind for continuing to expand it, but we need it.
We also have students who come in and say they want to change the world and they're not sure how. They'll intern with a nonprofit. And then this has been my experience over the last 15 years, is that they say, now we have to convince my family to let me do this. We didn't send you to college to work in a nonprofit and not make money. So I think part of that falls on us to try and educate people about the fact that there are really rewarding careers in the nonprofit space, and that one can do well by doing good. That's part of it. And we just had an interview weekend for master's students, and I would be lying if on Saturday I didn't have a few of them say, I really want to do nonprofit stuff, but are there jobs? So they're very concerned about that practicality. So I think we can do a little better there. The other thing I would share is I'm working with a research team now. We have 3 papers outlined, and it's studying nonprofit academic centers and their success and growth. So we presented one, fingers crossed everybody, we're getting ready to submit it to a journal in March. But the first one we surveyed nonprofit centers and asked about their founding. What exactly was it? Did they have a specific champion on campus? Did they have a specific funder? We're trying to find out what it is that we can leverage to help these sorts of nonprofit centers be successful and really define sustainability. The second project that we're just starting on is looking into that sustainability effort, because the challenge is, even though we would like to see this at even more, that we've grown now that over 400 universities offer some sort of nonprofit education. I'd love to see more of it, but more importantly, I'd love to see those 400 grow, be strong, and continue to serve more people. So hopefully we can try and make progress in those two areas and supporting our sector and helping incoming and prospective students know that this is a really interesting career path for them. We have another question, if we have time for one more. Jessica's noted she thinks it's implicit in this discussion is the professionalization of foundations, but per the data from Jeff, if 50% of foundations have assets of less than 500,000, can we expect these foundations to be more interested in taking on more trends or being more transparent?
I'll two answers. One is this is a place where Texas is exactly average. The national median for private foundations is also $500,000 of assets. So from that perspective, Texas is on par with everyone else. I suspect there is kind of a looming existential crisis for private foundations, and it goes something like this. If my grandparents owned, a string of car dealerships or McDonald's franchises in my town, when they retired, they would probably create a private foundation back in the day. If my parents owned the same string of dry cleaners or McDonald's or car dealerships, maybe they would have created a named fund at a community foundation. If my wife and I have that same business, we're going to create a DAF. So I'm kind of wondering, as we roll on in history here, and just as DAFs are getting more and more prevalent, where suddenly is it like the amusement park ride? Like, you must be at least this tall to ride this ride. Like, you must have at least this much in assets to call yourself a private foundation. So I think that within the sector, and as Michael noted, whether it's a B Corp, a charitable LLC, or a DAF, I think there's going to be competition at the lower end of the private foundation space for just a wide array of different giving vehicles. And that may in itself just kind of professionalize the private foundations to be more the 1 million, 5 million, $10 million start. And again, just think of the DAFs. If I have $1 million and look at what it's going to cost me to pay taxes and an accountant and the fiduciaries for a private foundation, or I write one check to Fidelity or the Greater Houston Community Foundation, and it goes straight into a DAF, that's kind of an easy sell. So I'm very curious, just from a data perspective, how that will affect the private foundation community, because there are just more tools available.
Jeff, we had somebody ask if the data for private foundations is similar to public foundations.
It is, and it's a little bit.
Quick to answer?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because a lot of public foundations are community foundations, and they exist more as money in, money out organizations, especially if they have a lot of DAFs. But broadly speaking, yes, the median number for both private and community foundations is far below what you would suspect if I stopped you on the street and said, tell me what that number is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Well, time flies when you're having fun. We are already at time, and I would love to thank Jeff and Michael for coming today, taking time out of this. They're doing this pro bono, except I'll get you a drink or something at an Arnova conference. How's that? We'll pick up a dessert for you. But they took time to be thoughtful about what the implications meant to us and to tailor their data, the data to us rather than give us the general. So I'm very grateful for that. We're lucky to have colleagues like them in our field as we work. I know some of the folks from our center, we can maybe stick around for a little bit, but thank you so much. Please log on to our center's website and you can get the full conversation and the slide deck that has links to all the information too. If you're interested in programming, if your organization needs help, reach out to us. All the contact information's there, because we're only here because we're trying to help your nonprofits. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Have a great rest of your President's Day.